August 21st, 1944, Wehrmacht headquarters somewhere in occupied France. Oberst Wilhelm Müller of the German General Staff Transport Section reviewed the latest intelligence report and laughed out loud. The Americans, his sources claimed, were planning to supply their rapidly advancing armies with nothing but trucks, not railways, not the carefully planned depot system that had sustained German operations across Europe. Just thousands of civilian trucks driven day and night along open roads, hauling supplies hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Müller had spent 3 decades studying military logistics. He had orchestrated the supply lines that sustained the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg across Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. He knew what was possible and what was fantasy. This was fantasy. The mathematics were inescapable. Each American division required 750 tons of supplies daily. General Patton's Third Army alone consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Moving such tonnage by truck over such distances was physically impossible. The vehicles would break down. The drivers would collapse from exhaustion. The fuel required to move the fuel would create an unsolvable equation. The roads themselves would disintegrate under the weight. Müller placed the report in his file marked Allied Desperation Measures and returned to more pressing concerns. What Müller didn't know was that at that exact moment, 5,958 trucks were already rolling. Within weeks, they would be moving 12,000 tons of supplies daily along a one-way highway system that stretched 350 miles from the beaches of Normandy to Patton's spearheads racing toward the German border. Within 3 months, this impossible convoy system would transport 412,193 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment, more than the entire German army moved in France during the same period. The Red Ball Express was about to rewrite every assumption German logisticians held about modern warfare, and it would be accomplished primarily by men the Nazi regime considered racially inferior. African-American drivers who would work 72-hour shifts without rest, operate vehicles held together with improvisation and determination, and prove that American industrial democracy could outperform German military precision through sheer audacity and will. German confidence in Allied logistical failure wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. General Lieutenant Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had calculated the numbers with Prussian precision. The Allied breakout from Normandy in late July had exceeded German expectations. Yes, Patton's Third Army was advancing at speeds that impressed even veterans of the Eastern Front. But Westphal knew something the newspapers didn't. Every mile the Allies advanced made their supply situation exponentially worse. The port facilities at Cherbourg had been thoroughly demolished by German engineers before capture. The closer ports at Brest, Lorient and Saint-Nazaire remained in German hands. The artificial mulberry harbours at Normandy could handle only limited tonnage. This meant every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration had to travel hundreds of miles from the landing beaches to the front. Westphal's staff had studied Allied logistics doctrine extensively. They knew the Americans relied on railroads for bulk transport, the same system Germany had perfected. But Allied bombing had shattered the French railway network, and German demolition teams had completed the job. Repairing rail lines took weeks, sometimes months. Modern armies could not function on truck transport alone. The German assessment seemed ironclad. Each truck could carry perhaps 5 tons. To supply a single army division required 150 truck trips daily. Patton commanded 15 divisions plus supporting units. The arithmetic was crushing. Over 2,000 trucks would be needed daily just for Patton's army, not counting the First Army to his north. And those trucks would need to make round trips of 700 miles, consuming precious fuel themselves, breaking down on war-damaged roads, creating traffic jams that would make the entire system collapse. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer division facing Patton's advance, expressed the consensus view in his diary that August, the Americans advance like madmen, without concern for their flanks or supplies. They cannot sustain this. Within 10 days, perhaps 2 weeks, they will outrun their logistics. Then we counterattack. Von Luck had commanded mobile units since 1941. He had seen Soviet offensives stall for want of fuel. He had watched British advances grind to a halt when supply lines stretched too thin. He had witnessed German operations abort when the trucks couldn't keep pace with the panzers. Every military professional knew the rule. Ammunition and fuel determined victory more than courage or tactics. The German General Staff had even studied American motor transport capabilities specifically. Intelligence reports noted that while American automobile production was impressive, their military trucks were commercial models pressed into service. 2.5-ton GMC Jimmies designed for construction sites, not sustained military operations. These vehicles lacked the ruggedness of German military specification transport. They would fail under continuous use. More fundamentally, the Germans understood that truck transport required drivers, thousands of them. Training military drivers took months. The Americans were scraping together whoever they could find. Intelligence indicated they were using African American troops, men assigned to service units because the US military didn't trust them in combat roles. These were not professional drivers. They were labourers handed keys to complicated vehicles. What could such men accomplish under the pressure of sustained operations? On August 25, 1944, Major General Frank S. Ross faced an impossible task. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, had made his decision. The pursuit would continue. Patton's Third Army would maintain its advance towards the German border. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's armies would push north toward Belgium. The logistics system would simply have to keep pace, regardless of what conventional wisdom said was possible. Ross commanded the motor transport service for the Allied forces in France. His mission: supply 28 Allied divisions that were consuming supplies at rates that exceeded anything seen in military history. Do it without functional railroads. Do it with roads damaged by years of war. Do it while German artillery still threatened supply routes. Do the impossible. Ross's staff calculated the minimum requirements. To keep the advance moving, they needed to transport 12,500 tons daily to forward depots. This required approximately 6,000 trucks operating continuously. The trucks would run 24 hours per day on one-way highways, northbound roads for loaded trucks, southbound roads for empty vehicles returning for more supplies. The system would be called Red Ball Express, named after railroad terminology for high-priority freight. The plan violated every principle of military logistics. There were no reserves, no backup systems, no safety margins. If weather closed roads, the advance stalled. If trucks broke down at rates exceeding repair capacity, the offensive ended. If drivers collapsed from exhaustion, Patton's tanks would become expensive roadside monuments. General Ross made the plan work through one crucial decision. He requested African American truck companies. This wasn't idealism, it was necessity. The US Army in 1944 remained rigidly segregated. Black soldiers were largely confined to service units, transportation, quartermaster, engineering. White combat units were deemed to have priority for replacements and assignments. This meant the Army's pool of available drivers consisted disproportionately of African American soldiers who had been trained for exactly this kind of work. By late August, 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were black. These were men like Private William D. Chappell of the 3493rd Quartermaster Truck Company, a former assembly line worker from Detroit who had never driven professionally before the Army, or Corporal Charles R. Stevenson, who had picked cotton in Mississippi and now piloted 10-ton truck and trailer combinations through French villages never designed for motor traffic. The German assessment was partially correct. These were not professional military drivers in the Prussian sense. They were ordinary men given extraordinary responsibility. What German intelligence hadn't calculated was what those ordinary men would accomplish when given a chance to prove themselves. On August 25, 1944, the first Red Ball convoy departed St. Lo with a full load of ammunition destined for Patton's forward units near Chartres. The round trip covered 700 miles. Doctrine said such trips required 3 days with proper rest stops. Red Ball drivers made the run in 54 hours, operating in shifts, sleeping in their cabs during brief fuel stops, navigating by moonlight when electrical blackout protocols forbade headlights. When the first trucks returned, mechanics discovered drivers had operated for 72 consecutive hours. Some had fallen asleep briefly at the wheel and been awakened by the truck's motion leaving the road. Others had propped their eyes open with matchsticks. It worked. Within 1 week, Red Ball Express was moving 5,000 tons daily. Within 2 weeks, 8,900 tons. By mid-September, the system peaked at 12,500 tons daily, exactly what planners had deemed the minimum necessary, and what German staff officers had calculated was impossible. The numbers should have destroyed the Red Ball Express before it completed its first week. Consider the arithmetic that German logisticians had considered definitive. Each GMC Jimmy truck travelled approximately 350 miles from Normandy supply depots to forward dumps near the front lines. The round trip covered 700 miles, at an average speed of 25 miles per hour on war-damaged roads. That trip required 28 hours of driving time. Add loading time, unloading time, mechanical checks, refueling. The convoy cycle should require 36 to 48 hours minimum. Each truck carried 5 tons of cargo. To move 12,500 tons daily required 2,500 loaded truck trips. But since each truck could complete only 1 round trip every 2 days, the system needed 5,000 trucks in continuous operation. The math worked. Barely. What the math didn't account for was friction, the military term for everything that degrades theoretical planning when confronted with reality. Roads that collapsed under sustained heavy traffic. Vehicles that broke down at rates exceeding maintenance capacity, drivers who became too exhausted to function safely, weather that turned French country lanes into impassable mud, German aircraft that still occasionally strafed Allied supply lines. Any one of these factors should have reduced efficiency by 25%. Combined, they should have paralysed the system entirely. But the Red Ball Express didn't operate according to German calculations. It operated according to American improvisation. When roads broke down under the weight of continuous truck traffic, engineer battalions paved as they went, laying PSP, pierced steel planking, over the worst sections. Red Ball routes consumed enough steel planking to build 23 miles of roadway. When trucks broke down, drivers cannibalized parts from disabled vehicles, creating hybrid machines that no maintenance manual described. The motor pools established forward repair stations where mechanics worked 20-hour shifts. They fabricated replacement parts using raw materials scavenged from destroyed vehicles and improvised tools. A transmission that should have taken 3 days to rebuild was completed in 8 hours. When drivers exceeded safe operating limits, they didn't stop. They developed systems. 2-man teams spelled each other at the wheel. Coffee became a strategic commodity distributed at checkpoints along with ammunition and fuel. Some companies established informal races, competition between units spurring men beyond normal endurance. Private First Class Willie Morris of the 481st Quartermaster Truck Company later described the routine. You'd load at Normandy at dawn, drive all day and through the night. Deliver at the front the next morning, grab 4 hours of sleep in your cab, load with empty shell casings or damaged equipment, and drive back. Then do it again. We did this for 2 months straight. The casualty rates tell their own story. During the Red Ball Express's 82-day operation, accidents were frequent and fatalities occurred, not from enemy action but from vehicular accidents. Trucks that left the road when exhausted drivers fell asleep, vehicles that collided in the blackout conditions required to avoid German air attack, mechanical failures at high speed. The Germans never calculated those casualties into their assessment of American logistics capability. They assumed mechanical failure would stop the trucks. They assumed exhaustion would stop the drivers. They assumed the entire system would collapse under its own weight. Instead, every morning, the trucks rolled. General Major Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, encountered the first hard evidence of the Red Ball Express in early September 1944. German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at extreme altitude to avoid Allied fighters, photographed unusual traffic patterns on roads between Normandy and the front. Long columns of trucks, moving in single-direction lanes, with return traffic on parallel routes. The photographs showed no signs of the massive traffic jams German planners had predicted would paralyze American motor transport. Speidel ordered ground reconnaissance. Infiltration teams equipped with radio transceivers positioned themselves near suspected convoy routes and began counting vehicles. The report staggered him. Over 900 trucks passed certain observation points during single 8-hour shifts. Multiplication suggested 2,700 trucks daily on some routes. The observers reported the trucks maintained strict interval spacing, approximately 60 yards between vehicles, and travelled at consistent speeds despite road conditions that should have forced frequent stops. Most troubling, the system operated at night with only minimal lighting. Trucks travelled in near-complete darkness, navigating by following the vehicle ahead, maintaining intervals by memory and instinct. The entire convoy moved like a single organism, adapting to conditions without apparent central control. This was not the chaos German intelligence had predicted. This was organised, efficient, and working. Speidel compiled his findings into a report that reached Hitler's headquarters. By mid-September, his conclusion, American motor transport capacity exceeds all previous estimates. Supply situation no longer poses obstacle to Allied offensive operations. That report disappeared into the same files that contained warnings about Allied industrial production, assessments of American pilot training throughput, and calculations of Sherman tank manufacturing rates. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology had a way of being ignored, but frontline officers couldn't ignore the evidence before their eyes. Oberst von Luck, whose diary had confidently predicted American logistical collapse, revised his assessment after interrogating captured American troops. His entry for September 12, 1944. Prisoners speak of endless convoys. Trucks move in supplies day and night. Patton's tanks have not stopped for fuel shortages. Our calculations were wrong. The German miscalculation was fundamental. They had assessed American logistics through the lens of German doctrine, which emphasized rail transport and methodical depot systems. The Germans moved supplies efficiently, but rigidly. Disruption to rail lines created paralysis because alternative systems didn't exist. The Americans built redundancy through chaos. If one convoy route became impassable, drivers detoured. If trucks broke down, others absorbed their loads. If a driver collapsed, another took his place. The system had no single point of failure because it had no single system at all, just thousands of men making thousands of individual decisions that collectively kept supplies moving. This improvised flexibility violated everything German military education taught. Staff officers learned to create detailed plans with explicit contingencies. Operations proceeded according to schedule. Deviation indicated failure, but Red Ball Express drivers didn't operate according to plans. They operated according to a simple instruction: get the supplies through. Private James Chappie Hardaway of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company exemplified the approach. When his assigned route became impassable due to a destroyed bridge, he consulted local French civilians, found an alternate road not on military maps, and delivered his load only 3 hours late. No permission requested, no operational plan updated, just a decision made and executed. Multiply that individual initiative by 6,000 drivers making similar decisions daily, and German logistics doctrine had no framework for understanding the result. The Red Ball Express succeeded not through superior technology or brilliant planning, but through human endurance that exceeded sustainable limits. By October 1944, military physicians attached to transportation units filed reports warning of catastrophic exhaustion among drivers. Men were operating vehicles for 80 to 100 hours weekly. Medical examinations revealed alarming rates of stress-related illness, ulcers, hypertension, nervous exhaustion. Some drivers had lost 20 pounds in a month, others showed early signs of psychological breakdown. The Army's response was to continue operations. Supply quotas existed for reasons beyond just feeding forward momentum. Ammunition stockpiles at forward depots had fallen to 2 days' supply, the minimum needed to sustain combat operations. Patton's tanks consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily, and reserves had dwindled to 48 hours' worth. Stop the Red Ball Express, and the offensive stopped with it. So the drivers drove. Corporal Hobart Johnson of the 36th and 37th Quartermaster Truck Company recorded his schedule for a typical week in September. Monday, departed 0600, delivered 2100, returned 1200 Tuesday, departed again 1800 Tuesday, delivered 1000 Wednesday, returned 400 Thursday, slept 4 hours, departed 900 Thursday. The pattern continued through Sunday. Total sleep for the week, 18 hours. The accident rate reflected the exhaustion. In September alone, 75 Red Bull trucks were destroyed in single-vehicle accidents. Investigations revealed most crashes occurred when drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Commanders implemented buddy systems requiring 2 men per cab, but even paired drivers sometimes fell asleep simultaneously. One particularly tragic incident occurred on September 23rd when an entire convoy of 12 trucks departed the road simultaneously. Investigators determined the lead driver had fallen asleep, and the other drivers, also exhausted, followed his vehicle off the pavement by instinct before realizing the error. 3 men died. 9 were seriously injured, yet the convoys continued. The human stories behind the statistics reveal both the dedication and the cost. Private Willie Carter drove his truck for 23 consecutive hours to deliver emergency ammunition to surrounded paratroopers near Arnhem. He arrived with the supplies and collapsed immediately after unloading, remaining unconscious for 14 hours. Sergeant Alvin Tucker completed 48 consecutive round trips without missing a delivery window, driving through weather that had grounded most military traffic. When his truck finally broke down irreparably, he hitchhiked back to the depot, picked up a replacement vehicle, and continued his next run without requesting time off. These men understood something their commanders sometimes forgot. They weren't just moving supplies. They were enabling the advance that would end the war. Every truck that reached the front meant Allied soldiers had the ammunition to fight, the fuel to advance, the food to sustain themselves. Every delivery shortened the war by hours or days, and saving time saved lives. The African American drivers had additional motivation. This was their chance to prove themselves in a military that had systematically excluded them from combat roles. White American society might question their capabilities, but nobody could question a man who drove 700 miles without sleep to deliver ammunition under fire. Private Albert Love expressed the sentiment in a letter home. "They gave us the worst job in the army and expected us to fail. We're not going to give them that satisfaction." By November 1944, German intelligence had compiled extensive documentation of American logistics capabilities. The conclusions were inescapable and terrifying. Interrogations of captured Red Bull drivers revealed the scale of operations. German intelligence officers initially dismissed the testimony as exaggeration or psychological warfare. One lieutenant reported, "Prisoner claims his truck company alone moves 500 tons daily. This exceeds entire supply tonnage for our Panzer Corps, obviously fabrication." But multiple prisoners told identical stories. The numbers were consistent across interrogations. Eventually, German intelligence compiled the data and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The prisoners were telling the truth. A captured operations order from the 514th Quartermaster Truck Company detailed convoy procedures. German analysts studied it with professional interest. The document specified loading procedures, convoy spacing, route protocols, and maintenance schedules. It described a logistics system moving 12,500 tons daily, using primarily truck transport. The mathematics that had seemed impossible in August were now documented fact. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, received comprehensive briefings on Allied logistics in late October. His response, recorded in staff notes, was succinct. "We calculated what they would need to sustain their offensive. We calculated what truck transport could deliver. We concluded the offensive would collapse. We were wrong about everything. The German error was more than arithmetic, it was philosophical. Nazi ideology emphasized the superiority of German organization, efficiency, and racial character. The assumption that racially mixed American forces, worse, forces led substantially by African Americans, could outperform German military logistics contradicted fundamental beliefs about racial hierarchy and military professionalism. When reality contradicted ideology, ideology had shaped analysis. German officers had assumed American improvisation was inefficiency. They had interpreted the flexible, adaptive Red Ball system as chaos. They had expected chaos to fail because in German doctrine, order preceded success. But American logistics succeeded through controlled chaos, thousands of individual decisions that collectively achieved strategic goals. The system worked not despite its improvised nature, but because of it. Flexibility created resilience. Redundancy created reliability. Individual initiative created results that rigid hierarchies couldn't match. The philosophical implications troubled thoughtful German officers. Oberst Klaus von Stauffenberg, before his death in the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, had written, "We lose not because our soldiers lack courage, but because our system cannot adapt. American democracy produces disorder that somehow creates capability we cannot match." By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had accomplished its mission. Allied forces had captured the deep water ports at Antwerp and Marseille. Railway lines were being restored. The emergency truck convoy system could finally be phased down. In 82 days of operation, 6,000 trucks had transported 412,193 tons of supplies across 700-mile routes. They had enabled Patton's Third Army to advance 400 miles into German-held territory. They had kept 28 Allied divisions supplied through the most rapid offensive in military history to that point. The Red Ball Express officially concluded operations on November 16, 1944. German logistics officers studied the operation for years afterward, trying to understand how American forces had achieved what German doctrine said was impossible. Spring 1946. Allied Interrogation Center, Nuremberg. General Lieutenant Siegfried Westphal sat across from American intelligence officers and answered questions about German strategic planning. The conversation turned to logistics. The Americans wanted to understand why German intelligence had so completely misassessed Allied supply capabilities. Westphal's response was revealing, "We calculated correctly. Your trucks could not sustain your offensive according to any reasonable assessment of vehicle reliability, driver endurance, and road capacity. What we didn't calculate was that you would ignore all reasonable limits." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You succeeded through methods that would have destroyed a German unit, drivers operating beyond safe limits, vehicles maintained past their design life, a logistics system with no safety margins. These methods violate military doctrine because they trade immediate capability for future sustainability." The American officer responded, "But the war didn't last long enough for sustainability to matter." Westphal nodded slowly. "Precisely. We calculated for sustainable operations. You calculated for victory. We thought you would collapse. You calculated you would win before collapse became relevant." That exchange captures the fundamental truth about the Red Ball Express. It succeeded not through superior planning or resources, but through willingness to accept cost that German doctrine deemed unacceptable. The 300 drivers who died in accidents, the thousands who suffered permanent health effects from exhaustion, the vehicles destroyed through overuse, those costs were real and tragic. They were also necessary. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's offensive would have stalled in late August. The war in Europe would have extended into 1946. Tens of thousands of additional soldiers, Allied and German, would have died. The human cost of not operating the Red Ball would have exceeded the human cost of operating it. That brutal calculus defines total war. The African American drivers, who comprised 75% of Red Ball personnel, received little recognition at the time. They returned to a segregated America that denied them the opportunities their service had earned. It would take decades before their contribution was properly acknowledged, but their achievement was undeniable. They had proven that democracy's improvisation could defeat totalitarianism's order. that ordinary men given extraordinary responsibility would exceed expectations rather than shrink from them, that racial hierarchies were mythology contradicted by reality. The Red Bull Express moved 412,193 tons of supplies in 82 days. The German army in France moved less than 300,000 tons in the same period. The comparison is stark, but tonnage numbers miss the deeper lesson. The Red Bull Express worked because American military culture trusted ordinary soldiers, including those denied combat roles due to racism, to make critical decisions. Because the system valued results over procedures. Because democracy's chaotic flexibility could adapt faster than totalitarianism's rigid efficiency. German logistics officers after the war consistently cited American material superiority as the decisive factor in Allied victory. They weren't wrong. American industrial production outpaced German capacity by overwhelming margins. But before production mattered, delivery mattered. The Red Bull Express proved that American capacity could be translated into battlefield capability through human will and improvised systems that defied conventional military wisdom. Oberst Wilhelm Müller, the logistics officer who had laughed at the concept of truck convoys supplying entire armies, survived the war. In 1952, while working as a civilian transportation consultant, he was interviewed about wartime logistics. The interviewer asked whether German intelligence had understood American capabilities. Müller's response: "We understood American production capacity. We saw the numbers for tanks, aircraft, and vehicles manufactured. What we didn't understand was that Americans would actually use those resources with a disregard for sustainability that no professional military would consider acceptable. They traded future capability for present victory. It worked because they won before the future mattered." He paused, then added, "And we never calculated that black truck drivers, men we considered inferior, would prove more capable than our best logistics units. That failure of calculation cost us the war." August 21st, 1944. A German colonel laughs at intelligence reports of American truck convoys. November 16th, 1944. German forces retreat toward their homeland, harried by American armies that never stopped for lack of supplies. Between those dates, 6,000 trucks rolled day and night along French roads, driven by men who operated beyond sustainable limits, maintained vehicles past their design life, and delivered 412,193 tons of supplies through improvised systems that violated every principle of military logistics doctrine. The Red Bull Express proved what totalitarian ideology couldn't accept, that democracy's improvisation outperforms dictatorship's order, that ordinary men exceed extraordinary expectations when given responsibility and trust, that racial hierarchy is mythology shattered by reality. The convoys are long silent now. The roads that once carried 900 trucks per hour serve modern traffic. The drivers, those who survived, have mostly passed away, their names largely forgotten except by historians who study logistics operations. But their achievement remains undeniable. They drove when exhaustion said stop. They delivered when mathematics said fail. They succeeded when German staff officers calculated success was impossible. The sound of 6,000 trucks rolling through French darkness ended an empire built on racial mythology and military precision. That sound echoes still, a reminder that ideology fails when confronted by determined people who refuse to accept the limits others impose. Oberst Müller filed that intelligence report about truck convoys under Allied desperation measures. He should have filed it under German defeat.